Welcome. This session is part of the 2024 Watershed Congress virtual program. The Watershed Congress is organized by the Delaware Riverkeeper Network in collaboration with many other organizations. My name is Dr. Eric Soldorf, and I am the Restoration Director and a Senior Scientist at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. I'm also the moderator for this session titled The Impact of Changing Climate on Water Availability in the Schuylkill Basin. Before we turn it over to our presenters, I have a few quick announcements. Again, this is the 2024 Watershed Congress. And just a quick note that many organizations and individuals have made this program possible. I would like to pause briefly to recognize our many partners. And again, it is a long list of partners, and we thank everyone for their sponsorship, for their contributions. A lot of work goes into making this happen. This session is titled The Impact of Changing Climate on Water Availability in the Schuylkill Basin. We are pleased to present our speakers for this session. We have three of the authors from the first study here today. Suna Akinkali is a PhD student in the Urban Water Engineering Group at the Luleå University of Technology in Sweden and completed her master's work in environmental engineering at Drexel University. Dr. Achira Amour is a postdoctoral researcher at Villanova University, working across water resources, stormwater management, and rainfall characteristics issues. And Dr. Patrick Gurian is a professor and environmental engineering program head at Drexel University. So with that, those are our first two presenters, and Dr. Gurian is here to help answer questions at the end. I will turn it over to you.
Hello, and good morning to everyone. My name is Suna Akinkali, and the first part of the presentation belongs to me. Now I will share my screen. Okay, hello again. My name is Suna Akinkali, and I am a PhD student at Luleå University of Technology in Sweden. Today, my former colleague Achira and I will be talking about a study that we conducted during our master's studies in Drexel University under the supervision of Dr. Olson and Dr. Guarian. This study was conducted in 2016, between 2016 and 2018, and was published last year in a journal called Water. As we all know, water resources are essential to the society and economy, providing services including drinking water, irrigation, transportation, energy generation, and recreation. And we have water management policies, which are designed to allocate available water resources to meet the demands under some uncertainty and variability, such as seasonal flow trends, droughts, floods, and groundwater levels. As we are all aware, the availability of our water resources strongly linked to the components of the hydrological cycle. On one hand, we are witnessing climate change significantly altering the cycle, not just about changing the precipitation patterns, but we are seeing melting of ice and snow, shift in soil moisture content, and change in runoff and stream flow conditions. Moreover, these alterations comes with the expectation of more frequent and severe extreme weather events, including droughts and floods. At the same time, we are transforming our land cover through deforestation, urbanization, agricultural practices, and infrastructure development. These changes, seemingly beneficial for immediate human needs, however, unfortunately, reduce the land's capacity to store and regulate water flow, and all of which can directly impact the availability of water resources. And on the other hand, we have an increased demand for water across various sectors due to the population growth. And the gap between available water resources and demand is expected to require difficult trade-offs, and consequently putting more pressure on water management policies to keep the balance between the demand and available sources. Unfortunately, conventional water resource management practices may not be enough to overcome uncertainties related to the future availability of water resources under extreme events. So also, we know that the impact of climate change on water resources varies from region to region, influenced by each basin's unique characteristics and land use patterns. Consequently, it is crucial to examine these effects at a local level to develop comprehensive strategies for addressing uncertainties related to the water resources availability. So with this in mind, our aim was to develop a model capable of assessing the availability of water resources in Schuylkill River Basin under the scenarios of climate and land use change. Our specific objectives included building a precipitation runoff model within a modeling environment called STELLA, and incorporating reservoir operation rules and watershed management policies to replicate the historical flows in the watershed. Then calibrating the model outputs with the historical stream flow data measured at the specific points by USGS gauges. Then projecting the stream flow conditions from 2020 to 2040 by applying future climate and land use change scenarios to the model. And final objective was to analyze simulations of current and future stream flow conditions to evaluate the watershed's water resource availability in the upcoming years. As I said, our study area was Schuylkill River watershed, which is one of the sub-watersheds located in the Delaware River Basin. It encompasses nearly 2,000 square miles and constitutes 11 counties. The major cities located in the basin are Pottsville, Reading, Pottstown, Norristown, and Philadelphia. And this watershed is the drinking water source of approximately 1.75 million people. As you can see on the map, the lower part of the basin is dominated by the developed land cover, whereas the upper and the central part of the basin is dominated by agricultural and forest land. According to the data from 2011, 27% of the watershed is covered by the developed land, 41% is covered by the forest land, and 29% is covered by the agricultural land. If we look at the annual water consumption in the watershed, the biggest consumer is the power sector, approximately accounts for 41% of the total annual withdrawals from the watershed. And the second biggest consumer is the drinking water sector, accounting 31% of the total withdrawals. And the largest drinking water consumer in the basin is Philadelphia Water Department, providing drinking water for approximately 40% of the population of Philadelphia through Schuylkill River watershed. Moving on to our modeling approach. On the left-hand side on the screen, you can see a map of Schuylkill River watershed with USGS gauges highlighted in red. To the right, the schematic of our model is shown. This model is basically the replica of Schuylkill River watershed map, featuring 27 nodes represented by blue circles on the picture. These nodes denote both USGS gauges and confluences within the watershed. And Blue Marsh Reservoir, which is the biggest water body in the watershed, is represented also in the model. There are five more reservoirs, including Broadshaw, Waitsville, Ontoloni, Still Creek, Green Lane reservoirs, 3 of which are excluded from our model. Those that we excluded from the model was Still Creek, Ontoloni, and Green Lane. The reason behind this decision was due to lack of historical data, both on inflow and also reservoir storage. Moving on the conceptual model, we have simulated stream flow conditions within the watershed on a daily time step using a lumped modeling approach. The lumped modeling approach assumes uniform conditions across subcatchments. As previously shown, the study area within the watershed has been divided into subcatchments based on river confluences and USGS gauges. Once the subcatchments were delineated, then we calculated the curve numbers based on land cover and soil data. Then other parameters such as precipitation, evapotranspiration, soil moisture were gathered and input to the data input to the model on a daily time step to accurately present the hydrological conditions in the watershed. And finally, watershed management policies were integrated into the modeling environment to represent the stream flow conditions accurately. Back in that time, we planned to integrate 3 key watershed management policies in our model. The first policy was demand deliveries. This policy addresses water demands from Philadelphia Water Department and a nuclear power plant, which is called Limerick Generation Station. Limerick Generation Station utilizes water from the watershed for both consumptive and non-consumptive purposes. The second policy was LGC water augmentation policy. In the instances where the stream flow conditions drop below established policy thresholds, LGC is required to replenish the Schuylkill River watershed. And this replenishment is facilitated through agreements within contracted water suppliers. And the third policy was drought and demand restriction. This policy is managed by Office of Water Resources Planning within the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. And the aim of this policy is to proactively respond to the potential drought conditions. However, the decision to implement any measure is made on case-by-case basis, and therefore specific actions outlined by this policy are dynamic and cannot be directly coded into the model, thus not included in our study. Finally, and additionally, we plan to simulate operation rules at Blue Marsh Reservoir according to the seasonal storage elevation, SPIR rule, conservation releases, and Delaware River Basin Commission directed releases. But as you can realize, on the model, the releases directed by DRBC from Blue Marsh Reservoir are not included in our model, because these releases triggered by the stream flow condition in the watershed and exceeded our modeling capabilities, thus not represented in our model. After coding the watershed management policies and feeding the model with the required data, the next step was to compare the results within the historical stream flow data for calibration and validation purposes. And this comparison showed a reasonably good qualitative agreement between both observed and model stream flow, as you can see on the graph, for the Norristown station, also for Blue Marsh Reservoir. And the rest of the presentation from now on will be given my colleague Achira.
Thank you, Ekin, for that great setup. And that while that was the main section of our modeling process for our project, the next step is to include climate and land use. So like Ekin talked about it in her initial slides, they are 2 major processes that affect the water availability, and therefore we wanted to try and quantify their impact on the water availability within the watershed. So we wanted to simulate the stream flow for the period of 2020 to 2040 by first looking at the climate conditions. So we did this by looking at the varying carbon dioxide emission levels, and we looked at the RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5 to understand the range of possibilities based on the varying emission levels. And the second part was to look at local climate change parameters using data from 6 GCM models. I will talk about this in the upcoming slides, but while GCM models give a good understanding of the overview patterns, we looked at downscaling processes to kind of understand how what that data would translate at a local level. The second part of it was to look at the land use changes, and this will be explained in detail in the upcoming slides as well, but we wanted to look at how different types of land use changes would affect the stream flow within the watershed. So to first start off with climate models, climate modeling. So climate models, which are GCMs, which are general circulation models, provide data for a specific area based on the local precipitation, temperature, evapotranspiration, and they give a just an overview of the climate conditions in an area, but the resolution of that is not fine enough to understand the effects at the regional levels. Therefore, we looked at downscaling methods to look at how the large scale data set would translate at a local level. And to do this, we looked at two major methods. The first one was to look at how historical associations between precipitation events and their corresponding pressure and temperature changes would translate in the future. So basically, this was looking at historical data and understanding the connection between pressure and temperature changes to when the precipitation events occurred and how they occurred, and tried to understand, trying to use that relationship to predict how similar temperature and pressure changes in the future would result in precipitation events. And while this methodology was proved to be helpful for specifically areas that had a lot of data, so that basically just ended up being gauges that were in cities that had long records of data. So while we are looking at the entire watershed, there are many gauges which do not, mainly in the upper and the middle parts of the watershed, that do not have a large long record of data, which is why we had to go into looking at the second method of downscaling GCM data, which is LOCA, which is the localized constructed analogs statistical downscaling method. So this looks at predicting the regional effects of a climate based on the topography and the historical data in a specific location. This looks at data from 32 GCMs and also provides data for a grid of 6 kilometers. So with this data set, we looked at a historical data set and wanted to project it out from 2020 to 2040. And the outputs from this, which were basically precipitation and rainfall, were then put into this single land surface and hydrology model, which is associated with the LOCA data set called the variable infiltration capacity model, which is the WIC model, in which the high resolution daily precipitation and temperature were put in as inputs to get soil moisture data for our analysis. So using the LOCA data set, we had to decide which GCMs to use. So we selected the 6 GCMs that are shown on the slide here. This was mainly done by talking to the climate experts within the university, but also to provide a good representation of both international and national climate models. So collectively, using LOCA and WIC, the variable infiltration capacity model, our resulting data set included daily precipitation, evapotranspiration, and soil moisture data from 2020 to 2040 for 6 GCMs, and using 2 emission scenarios for each of them, creating a total of 12 possible climate change conditions. So moving on to the land use characteristics, we wanted to understand how the changes in land cover and land use would affect the water availability within the watershed. And to do this, we looked at using population growth as a proxy for change in impervious land cover. So before going into the details of that, similarly to what Ekin mentioned earlier in the presentation, land cover in the Schuylkill River watershed includes forested land in the upper parts, agricultural land in the middle sections, and more urban areas in cities such as Philadelphia and Reading. And the total percentages that come up is 41%, 29, and 27 for the forested, agricultural, and urban areas respectively. So this table shows, now coming back to the population growth, this table shows the population growth that happens historically in the 5 counties within the Schuylkill River watershed and the future projections for these counties. So the historical ones were based on the Census Bureau database, and the future ones were based on the Pennsylvania population projections by the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. So these projections were based on base population, fertility rates, survival rates, and migration rates from and within these within the country. So we can see that in comparison to the historical population growth seen for each of the counties, the future population growth are significantly higher, especially for the Berks, Montgomery, and Philadelphia counties. We see more than 15% population growth expected. So we wanted to incorporate these trends into land cover, and to do so, we included these as the baseline of how land cover would change to accommodate the population rates projected here. And coming back to the 3 land use scenarios that I mentioned before, we wanted to take it one step further by assessing how these population trends could change even further based on varying scenarios. So the first one was looking at as is, which is the as is scenario, which looked at historical trends and change in impervious cover. So this would be just the percentages that were shown on the table in the previous slide. For the sprawl situation scenario, we wanted to look at how these projections would change if the urbanization outpaced the population growth within these counties. So to reflect that, we increased the as-is scenario by 25%. And for the SMART, we wanted to include possible conservation policies that could be implemented, which would dampen the effects of urbanization. And to do this, we decrease the rates calculated in the as-is scenario by 25%. And then once we had these percentages available, we calculated the drainage area for each specific gauge within the network that Ekin presented earlier in the presentation, and adjusted the land cover for each of them using the curve number method. So for each of them, when we increase the urbanization or the population growth rates, we increase the impervious cover for that land, for that drainage area, and decrease the land associated with the agricultural areas to offset the increase in the urbanization areas. So we did this using ArcGIS and using that, using the updated or adjusted land cover configurations, we came up with new curve numbers, which were then used to predict the, estimate the flow going into the gauges based on these updated land cover scenarios. So collectively, with both the climate and land use changes, our model estimated what stream flow would be in the future for the period of 2020 to 2040. But to analyze the availability of water resources, we selected the stream closest to the proximity of the PWD, which is the Philadelphia Water Department intakes. And we chose Norristown as it was the nearest upstream gauge, located 10 miles upstream of the Philadelphia intake. And once we chose this gauge, we also wanted to use a threshold which could tell us if the stream flow objectives were met or not. And for this, we used the flow target at Norristown to be a combination of the amount required for the maximum potable water demand set by PWD, the demand by for the fish passage operation at Fairmont Dam, and a safety factor, all of which came up to be 13.73 cubic meter per second. But using the projections, by the end of 2024, this was estimated to be 13.9 cubic meter per second. So we then used the land use scenarios and the climate change scenarios and just simulated stream flow, and then compared it to this stream flow objective. And this table gives us the percentage of days that the stream flow objectives were met. So looking at the historical data, we saw that historically about the the stream flow objective was met about 90% of the time. But when we look at the climate change scenarios for the RCP 4.5, there was a range of 67% to 76% for the RCP 4.5 and 67% to 76% for the RCP 8.5. So compared with the historical period, the number of days each year failing to meet the target could increase is by as much as 23% under the most extreme scenario, suggesting a need for revised water management protocols. So to summarize, under the most extreme climate scenario, as many as 82 additional days each year may fall below the stream flow target, emphasizing the need for revised stream flow objectives. We also saw that based on our model, the climate change had the most impact on the simulated stream flow, with land use having very little impact in comparison. So even with adjusted land use managements, and similarly to the land use, the RCP 4.5 versus RCP 8.5 had very minimal effect on the simulated stream flow through for the future. So the low impact of the emissions and the land use development scenarios show that even with us changing land use management or emissions, we would require significant water management policy changes to account for the significantly reduced stream flow. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of model limitations within our models, just to provide context for our findings. So there's always uncertainty between the GCMs and the RCPs, which are the regional climate projections and the hydrological models. And while we wanted to get an understanding of the regional elements, of course, the setup of these models would affect the uncertainty of the data within the data we incorporated. And the other part was our study didn't look at the at incorporation of green infrastructure within the land use changes, which may provide a lot more buffer in terms of the impact that intensifying precipitation would have on these stream flows. So in conclusion, based on the projections, meeting all the water demands within the watershed will be difficult in the coming decades, and our model will be able to support any changing policies, especially with climate change. For example, if the blue marsh objectives need to be adjusted, our model would allow to understand how these adjustments would have an impact on the watershed level, and also how different gauges could help manage the collective watershed if these larger reservoirs are more restricted in terms of having water available and also meeting any scarcity that may be coming up in the future. And adding to that, so the model can be adapted to also simulate possible drought conditions, which could occur due to the effects of climate change, land use, and water policy. So our model could help understand how these different variables would interact in the future. Thank you for allowing us to present our work. And I just wanted to bring up all of the authors on this paper with their current email addresses in case anyone has any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Suna and Achira, for that presentation. Before we move into any questions there, we are actually going to move on to the second part of this presentation, which deals with Chester County, and Chester County, of course, is partly included in the Schuylkill watershed, but also watersheds that are outside the Schuylkill watershed, even across different basins. So for that, we have two presenters. We have Kate Huddlemeyer, who is a water resource planner with the Chester County Water Resources Authority, with experience working at local and regional scales to advance clean water goals that support thriving communities, and Dr. Suna Bune, who is the executive director at the Chester County Water Resources Authority as well. So with that, Kate and Suna, I will turn it over to you for the second part of the presentation.
Thanks. Well, as Eric said, my name is Kate Huddlemeyer, and I'm so happy to be here with you today. And as a quick introduction to the Chester County Water Resources Authority, we are part of the Chester County government. We were established in 1961 with a 4-part mission: water resources planning and outreach, sustainable water supply management, water quality and stormwater management, and flood protection. And so this is our water universe here in Chester County. We're home to more than 2,300 miles of streams, along with an incredible network of groundwater aquifers, lakes, wetlands, and reservoirs. We're a predominantly headwaters county, so if we zoom outwards to the watershed scale, our area of impact, if you will, covers 1,400 square miles, 144 municipalities, 8 counties, 3 states, 5 river basins, 21 watersheds, and 78 sub-basins, not that anyone's keeping track. And so we're excited to say that Chester County recently adopted Watersheds 2045, which is an updated integrated water resources plan to serve as a common framework we can all use to understand, prioritize, and manage issues impacting our waters today and in the future. And so this plan lays out a vision of sustainable Chester County water resources that provide clean water, support healthy aquatic and wildlife habitats, enable thriving communities, and offer abundant and accessible recreational opportunities for all through 2045 and beyond. And it also outlines 7 critical goals for meeting that vision, covering areas including public engagement, recreational access, natural resource protection and restoration, local and regional planning, and, as is probably most relevant to this conversation today, ensuring sustainable water supplies. And so our new plan, Watersheds 2045, builds on the legacy of our original plan, which was called Watersheds and was originally released in 2002. And we've seen in Chester County immense progress since that plan was released, including large-scale land preservation and restoration efforts, as well as stream upgrades and delistings. But that being said, the world is very different today than it was in 2002, and it was critical for us to update our strategies accordingly. And so a large part of understanding where we need to head over the next 20 plus years is determining exactly where we currently are. And if we look at the last 20 plus years of data from the county's longstanding water monitoring partnership with the USGS, specifically for biotic integrity, as you can see here on the screen, we can see that our higher performing monitoring sites remain steady over time. And there's a generally positive trend of increasing water quality in sites that have historically not scored as well, which is incredibly encouraging, and we believe truly reflects the investments made in both conservation and restoration by both the county and our many partners over the years. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that we've conquered all of our water resources challenges. As of 2022, roughly 78% of the streams assessed by PADEP in our planned study area were listed as impaired for one or more of their designated uses. So our largest sources of impairments were agriculture, specifically siltation, and urban runoff and storm sewers. Other causes of impairment included excess nitrogen and phosphorus, flow modifications, pathogens, and legacy contaminants like mercury and PCBs. Water quality is obviously only half of the puzzle here, with the other half being water quantity. And as our landscape changes, especially to accommodate new growth, we know that there will be changes to the way that water is both used and how it moves through our systems. And in light of both changes in precipitation patterns due to climate change and the impacts of impervious cover on groundwater and baseflow recharge, as has been discussed in the earlier presentations, we recognize that there is a significant need to pay very close attention to water availability here in Chester County. And just as I mentioned, it is one of the 7 key goals that we've laid out for our plan. And this is actually something that Chester County and our many partners have been looking at for a long time. Chester County is included in the groundwater protection area that was established by the Delaware River Basin Commission back in the 1980s, especially the northern part of our county, noting that there are particular areas that may be more vulnerable to water stress and overuse. And the good news is that overall that program has been very successful. Cumulative net decreases have been seen in groundwater withdrawals from 2000 to 2020 with some of the policies that have come through the groundwater protection area, despite significant population growth and development. And And we also have a long local record of groundwater level monitoring in partnership with the USGS, which we'll touch on in a little bit. And so I also wanted to just call out that as of 2020, approximately 35% of total public water withdrawals in Chester County came from groundwater. The remaining 65% come from approximately 7 major source water intakes throughout the county. And our total water demand, the estimated water demand in Chester County back in 2020 was 52.5 million gallons per day. So as part of the Watersheds 2045 planning process, we took a look at our surface water budgets in particular to ensure that we had an up-to-date understanding of the threats to water availability, both today and in a future that's continually impacted by a changing climate. And so Chester County has abundant surface and groundwater resources, as I mentioned, and these have historically been resilient to drought conditions. However, some of the water budget analyses that we completed identified a handful of areas of potential water stress that could result from high demand, drought conditions, or a combination of the two. And so the map here on the screen shows our analysis of 2020 surface water withdrawals. These are modeled water budget estimates based on the historical lowest 7-day average flow that occurs roughly once every 10 years. And so what we found overall, most of Chester County is at a lower risk for overstressing our surface water supplies during drier times, which is great. However, there are portions of, in particular, the Upper Brandywine, some of the Lower Octorara, and Valley Creek, which drains to the Schuylkill, where public conservation measures and industrial and corporate commercial conservation measures will be infinitely more critical to protecting our water supplies, both for industrial and human uses, but also for aquatic habitat. And so with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Sana Bien, who will walk through some of Chester County Water Resource Authority's efforts to understand and manage water availability today and beyond.
Thanks, Kate. So I'm going to walk through some of the initiatives in Chester County related to water availability and climate change, in addition to finishing up our Watersheds 2045 plan. So in Chester County, the USGS maintains 24 groundwater observation wells. The wells provide regular data on normal conditions and seasonal variations related to groundwater and various geologic formations, so we kind of space them out that way. And we publish monthly reports. I'll show you where to find them shortly, for our groundwater monitoring network. And you can see we do have some locations where it's persistently in drought watch or drought warning. So the yellow dot up in the northwest corner, that's West County Township. It's persistently in some sort of drought watch or warning. Next slide. So there are differences between the Schuylkill watershed and the watersheds in Chester County. We know that groundwater and surface water are interconnected. The location and productivity of groundwater supplies is determined a lot by geology. Chester County's geology is predominantly crystalline, with pockets of Triassic sedimentary rock and carbonate rock, including limestone and marble. In terms of water supply, the carbonate geology forms some of the most productive aquifers in the county, despite being prone to sinkholes. But the groundwater flows through a network of fractures and fissures and caves in the rock, and are enlarged as water dissolves into the carbonate geology around it. So for this reason, the water yields tend to be higher than in other geologic formations. And also, as Kate mentioned, portions of the of Chester County are in the DRBC groundwater protected area. So the differences in geology, as well as water users and uses in the county, are also different from what you saw in Schuylkill. We don't have the level of industrial users withdrawing water from our streams and rivers. It's not a big source for the power generating sector, but we still do have that increase in population, as Kate mentioned. So we're seeing that 19% increase from 2020 to 2045. Next slide. So if you recall last summer, we were almost in a drought. The state declared a drought watch for Chester County for about 126 days from about mid-June to mid-October. And then it rained a lot. So before it rained, we created this dashboard so that we could provide some information for our constituents, our municipalities, as well as the public. So I just wanted to touch on some of the pieces included in this dashboard. So the groundwater observation network. Let me go through this one first. Sorry. So first we have the current conditions, which show the drought status throughout the state. It also includes graphs of USGS data, the 30-day moving average, as well as the National Weather Service's rainfall amounts over the last 90 days, stream flow, so it shows the 7-day average, and also the drought monitor for the Northeast region. Next slide. So this also includes, like I mentioned, the groundwater observation well network. So you can kind of navigate through that, and it gets updated monthly. So this also includes those monthly reports. You can have access to those. So it basically shows the status of each of the wells in our network, and we publish these monthly. It also includes FAQs, so what a drought declaration is, levels of drought status, so drought watch, warning, emergency, and some other information. It also includes conservation tips for homeowners as well. And lastly, the drought dashboard includes forecasted conditions, which shows the 8 to 14-day predictions, as well as monthly and seasonal precipitation outlooks. Next slide. So one of the other things that we did do in terms of climate change is to try to get a sense of what the storms are going to look like moving into the future. So we estimated the increase in precipitation that might occur in the future for varying frequencies and durations. So we did this for the 1, 2, 5, 10, 25, 50, 100, and 500 year occurrence intervals. And also did it for varying durations. So 1, 2, 3, 6, 12, and 24-hour event duration. And so we had these developed for each decade between 2030 and 2100. And for these, we used the CMIP-5 GCM scenarios for RCP 4.5 and 8.5, which I think that the previous presenters discussed. And so we had a set of, so we ended up developing these, and we were able to identify, what those storm events are going to be like into the future as we move forward, whether or not we use it for flood modeling or managing stormwater, because we all know that the 100-year storm is no longer the 100-year storm. So we are hoping to make this available to our future planning, as well as our municipalities and other partners who may want to use this data moving forward. And with that, we'll take any questions. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Sunga and Kate, for that presentation. With your presentation just finishing, let's start the questions there. Sunga, you were talking about the climate change, and it's helpful that you're using the same climate change scenarios, the 4.5 and the 8.5. It seems like it is more straightforward to address stormwater and flooding issues with climate change, but you did mention how a fair amount of water supply, the human water supply, public water supply, is actually from groundwater. Is there enough specificity in those downscaled climate models to actually start to look at scarcity in the groundwater resources. You mentioned you were part of the um, groundwater protected area, and that there were 3 sub-watersheds that have that. Is that something that's possible at this point in thinking about climate change, or is that difficult to do?
And so, I mean, I think it's hard for us to kind of predict that. I mean, obviously it's the groundwater that recharges our base flows. So that gives you a sense. That gives us a sense of where our groundwater levels are on top of our monitoring network. Most of the private wells that are used for water supply aren't regulated either by the state or by the health department or even the county. So I find it difficult to kind of gauge those water levels, and the difficulty is understanding how deep they are, how much water supply they actually have, and the underlying geology. So I know that the county health department has been trying to get a better idea of the wells that are in the county, and so they're the ones that do the permitting, so they can actually get better data as permits are issued. The historical ones are a little difficult to track, so it's hard to get that data. I know that the health department has been starting to try to get more information in terms of the private wells.
Another thing that I think is unique to Chester County is that you all use quite a bit of discharge to groundwater as an indirect kind of beneficial reuse, not a direct beneficial reuse. Can you speak to whether or not that plays an important role, and is that actually part of the plan to deal with climate adaptation and this idea of a greater variability in precipitation, and so you might actually be able to use beneficial reuse as one means of storing and flattening out some of those curves.
So when you say discharge to groundwater, do you mean infiltration and promoting
Yeah, right.
infiltration and nature-based solutions? So we do obviously promote more nature-based solutions, especially when it comes to stormwater, so that the groundwater levels can be recharged and also infiltrate and also feed our streams as well as base flow. But there are no particular initiatives other than promoting more infiltration in terms of if we do development reviews, we'll promote more infiltration as opposed to actually just storing and then discharging to the streams.
Yeah, that's certainly something that I think we see pretty consistently. The thing I think that is somewhat unique, and I'm not really familiar with it, is actually on the wastewater side that in a lot of areas in the southeastern Pennsylvania, a lot of it's discharged just to surface water, and you guys actually have the ability not only through infiltration of stormwater, but infiltration of treated wastewater. Is that a big component of planning and of the kind of the water balance in Chester County?
I think that there are areas where it plays a role. We're still trying to get a handle on how much of a role that it plays and if there are any unintended consequences. But
Right.
certainly I think certainly spray irrigation of treated wastewater, especially for some of our smaller communities, has been growing. We also have a significant portion of the county that is on septic. And so, that helps as well for localized recharge. And certainly through the county's comprehensive plan, Landscapes 3, we certainly take a look at where it is and may not be so appropriate to extend public sewer, largely it's to minimize sprawl, but also for some of the less noted benefits, which include localized recharge. So yeah, I think it might be a little bit more anecdotal than database, but it's certainly something that that we know plays a role.
Right. Fantastic. Well, then, turning back over to the Temple group and looking at the Schuylkill watershed, there's certainly a lot of interesting results in there. First, I want to start with a clarification question. I think both groups have used the RCP 4.5 and 8.5, and just so for those folks that are listening to this, to characterize what kind of emission scenarios those are, I think that they were medium, high scenarios. Is that correct in terms of are those extreme scenarios? Are those like low carbon emission scenarios? How would you characterize the 4.5 and 8.5? I guess that's for Suna or Chira.
Yeah, so 8.5 is definitely the high emissions, and there was a 2.6, 4.5 and 8.5 when we were working on our project. So this is the medium and the high level emissions. But with current research is showing that the RCP 8.5 is looking like what is going to be medium level emissions for the future. But when we were working on this project, it was we were looking at both medium and high, which was 4.5 and 8.5.
Yeah, so that's
And
pretty
Eric,
scary.
just to
Go ahead.
clarify,
Yeah.
so the 4.5 is what we know as the moderate scenario, and just more specifically, it's where the emissions peak around 2040 and then decline, and then RCP 8.5 is where the emissions continue to rise through the 21st century.
Right. Pretty scary that now looks like a medium scenario.
Yeah, and for our storm event analysis, the 8.5 scenario, so the 2100, if you look at the 100-year storm and the 500-year storm, we're seeing an increase of around 45%.
Wow. And that was the 100-year storm and the 500-year storms. So those big planning storms in terms of floodplain management are increasing by nearly 50% out at the end of the century. Yeah, pretty extraordinary. The results also for the deficits that you all modeled, those are some pretty striking numbers and a little bit scary to think about going from 10% deficit now to 30 to 35% deficits. One of the things that I think I was curious about that was how big of deficits those are. Like when you guys talk about you're not meeting the flow target at the Norrisville gauge, does that mean that you're missing it by a half a cubic meter per second, or are those substantial deficits and are they protracted deficits? So can you talk a little bit about those additional days in the modeling? Do they occur in the summer, fall when we normally get droughts, or do you actually start to see droughts year round with those simulations?
I can address this question. Unfortunately, we haven't analyzed our data in terms of how much deficit we will have, or like in which seasons we will see these deficits occurring. But also it's not possible for me to go back and check the data, but I have these like graphs, and I roughly looked at those graphs to have an idea about this. And it's very, very rough and eyeballing, but I can say that the period that we simulated, 20 years, the droughts will like repeatedly occur during summers, and interestingly, November, December period. But I have no estimate about the deficits, like in terms of how many cubic meters or how many CFS we have. I couldn't say anything, and I don't want to misguide anyone saying something wrong.
Yeah, no, but that is useful. Yeah, so the end of fall, at the end of that low flow period, is when you see them. But can't speak to the deficits themselves. I think it's also striking that land use in your study had such a small effect relative to climate change. I think that's a rather sobering statement, that even with aggressive practices, that there are some difficult decisions and discussions that have to happen, and perhaps changes to water management, given that land use doesn't look like it's one of the tools that will easily ameliorate this. Can you speak to how surprised you were about the effect of land use, and what you also think of as the strategies that can be used, given that land use maybe isn't such a powerful tool to address the shortages?
Yeah, so I think similarly to what was mentioned in the second presentation, it was it made sense that the climate would have such a high impact, because looking at 2023, there was a drought period and then suddenly a lot of rainfall. So that would be the driving force in terms of availability of water resources. But the way we looked at land use was looking at population growth as a proxy for impervious cover. And it would be helpful to go into use our model, but do a detailed level of study to look at a raster file or something in our GIS that looked at a cell by cell comparison. And while we looked into how the land cover has changed over the decades using the National Land Cover Database data, it did not give us a good estimation because it was also very large scale. But when you look at it cell by cell, especially I'm currently in the city of Philadelphia, there's a lot of construction and a lot of urbanization that keeps happening simultaneously, but I don't know how much of that is incorporated within these data sets we're using for land cover. So I think with, and the second thing, as I mentioned with the limitation, green infrastructure is being implemented in many cities all over the country, and especially with Philadelphia's Green Cities Clean Water Act, they are trying to do they've already reached their 10-year mark, and they're trying to do a lot more in the upcoming years, but we could not incorporate the impact of that within our land cover assessment. So our land cover data set just gave an overview understanding of how these changes would impact the water resources. But I think even with getting a detailed understanding of how the land cover could impact these resources using a more a regional data set and understanding more of the local changes, climate change would still, I believe, would still be the driving force because of the varying rainfall patterns we're seeing right now.
Right, it does seem dominant. Another thing I was curious is that with those projections and with the stark reality of the climate change that we're facing, have you, as researchers, seen much interest by the water supply companies in these modeling results? What kind of conversations with Philadelphia Water Department? That there are private water suppliers that are off in the Schuylkill River, like Aqua Pennsylvania. Any follow-up from them about these kinds of results or ability, and perhaps maybe they're doing their own modeling on some of these questions as well.
I guess I'll briefly take that just as soon as the paper came out, consultant checked in with me and said, "Hey, can I get a copy of that?" So it's really great when people do read your work. I also know that, in addition to Philadelphia Water Department doing their own studies, I know that New York City's Water Department is also looking at climate change and actually doing some of the same studies that Chester County has been doing in terms of updating these storms in response to climate change. So I do think that people are trying to be proactive. And I think that what this study says is just the need to look into those policies. I mean, I wouldn't despair yet. I think there are policies out there that can help us manage these challenges. But I think it's really great that these agencies are starting to look at different policies, and we'll also have to look at all the different stakeholders from recreational water users to the water supply, and of course the aquatic ecology as well.
Fantastic. And we are starting to get towards the end of the time that we have, getting out to an hour, folks. Wondering if any of you have questions for each other that you wanted to address about the research or the policy that others are implementing before we wrap up. And
So I just wanted to do, I guess Kate can probably chime in too about, how we did our modeling. It's much more simplistic modeling. We use the watershed management model for our Watersheds 2045 update. But in terms of applying those population projections, we actually, so Chester County has about 30%, over 30% of our land as preserved. So we were able to exclude that area for development. So it limited where the population was going to go. So that kind of helped to give us an idea of where the increase in pervious surfaces and additional stormwater runoff and all the additional impacts was, I mean, that's kind of how we applied that population growth and development that way. But luckily, there's a long heritage of land preservation in Chester County.
Yeah, that's a pretty extraordinary number. I'm sure folks are envious of having 30% in some type of conservation preserve. So yeah, that does help and creates the specificity for your planning. Any other final thoughts? Anybody want any last comment to be part of the video before we wrap up?
I will make one more comment if you want it, which is just, I think that everybody's done a great job of acknowledging the huge uncertainties here. And so I think that's really important. I think don't take any number as a concrete prediction. At the same time, you look at the range of scenarios considered here in terms of emissions, in terms of land use, and in terms of different GCMs, and they're all pointing in the same direction. So I think that maybe there, don't hang your hat on any specific number, but boy, all the scenarios do seem to be pointing to this being something that we need to deal with going forward.
Yeah, right. The weight of evidence is pretty consistent. Yeah, fantastic. Well, again, thank you all. I'm afraid it's time to wrap up our session, but I want to thank our speakers once again for taking the time to share their knowledge, your insights, your experiences with us for this Watershed Congress presentation. I do encourage listeners to view the virtual exhibit hall page of the Watershed Congress website for information about event supporters, opportunities to connect, and resources for your own work. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy all of the Congress presentations. And again, most of all, thanks to our presenters for taking the time to share your research and your work. Thank you so much.